at 21 years old, I've always felt like, I experienced the greatest honor of my life at such a young age, and just I feel incredibly blessed to have gotten the chance, especially to serve with the guys I served with. I said earlier, I mean, we still remain close, and they're just some of the best guys that I can imagine, and just, it was, like I said, just an honor to stand with them and be a part of it.
Welcome to the Empower Podcast, the show where we discuss big ideas with leaders and change makers as we work to create a Mississippi where everyone can rise. This is Grant Callen. Thank you for joining us. Today's conversation is with a Mississippian you need to know. He grew up in Yazoo City and Hattiesburg. He's a Marine and a Purple Heart recipient, and he's a constitutional lawyer. Today, he's doing critically important work defending Mississippians whose rights have been threatened by government action. He's the founder and CEO of American Dream Legal, a nonprofit public interest law firm. So he has defended the U.S. Constitution as a soldier in uniform, and now he's defending that same Constitution in courtrooms. He's married to the lovely Kelly Rice, and they have 4 children and live in Madison. And in today's episode, I want you to hear his story. I want you to hear about some of his litigation that he's doing on behalf of Mississippians. And I want to ask him about the constitutionality of school choice. Even after all these years, questions continue to arise about whether school choice programs like ESAs and vouchers would be unconstitutional because of Section 208 in the Mississippi Constitution. So we have much to discuss. Let's jump in. Aaron Rice, welcome to the Empower Podcast.
Hey, Grant, thanks for having me. I know we've been planning on getting together for a long time, and glad we finally could.
Look, you were one of the first people I invited when I launched this podcast 2 years ago.
You really did.
It was easier to get the governor on than to get you in.
It's been a long time coming, but I'm glad we're doing it.
I'm glad you're here. I've been looking forward to this. So many different directions that I thought about starting this conversation. But let me start here. So where were you on 9/11, and how did that day shape your future?
Man, that day had a huge effect on my future. I mean, kind of one of the most pivotal days in my life for sure. So I was at school, it was during school hours that happened. I was a senior in high school at the time at Oak Grove, outside of Hattiesburg. And I was actually on a period where I was a student aide, so I would go around and, just tackle little administrative chores that needed to be done. So I wasn't actually in a classroom, and I walked into one, and they had pulled the TV out and had it on the TV, and saw the plane, the second plane hit, I think. And what really stood out to me, and I still remember about that day, of course we all remember the gravity of it and just the horror of it and everything. But I, unlike really any of my fellow classmates that I knew of, I immediately recognized the significance of what was happening. And, that I attribute that to my dad. He was a really involved guy. He was a forester, and really taught me, though, that it doesn't matter whether you're a farmer, forester, what you are, you should care about your country and understand, the policies of your country and understand the political philosophies that drive those policy choices. And so I'd grown up always having those kind of discussions with him. And he was also very interested in, military history. So his father, my grandfather, had been a Marine in World War II, one of those guys that lied about his age. I think he was 14 or 15 when he signed up, and was immediately thrown into the Pacific, wound up on Iwo Jima with a flamethrower. And if you know anything about that the survival odds of that were low. And so he made it back, and so my dad's brother, Stephen Rice, who lives here in Mississippi, also was, drafted into Vietnam. And so, my dad just had always had, a very keen interest in military history. And so we'd always talked about various conflicts and things like that. So I knew, the second that second plane hit, we all started to grasp that this was an intentional attack. And I'd actually learned about Osama bin Laden earlier that year. So, of course, none of my classmates, knew who he was at the time. I mean, most Americans didn't. And so, I knew about Osama bin Laden and the threat he posed, and saw the second plane hit, and, kind of immediately started putting together that, this was a terrorist attack being, taken out or performed on American soil, killing what had to, add up to hundreds or thousands of Americans. And so I recognized, immediately that we were going to go to war. And I literally remember to this day, I've never forgotten it. That afternoon I was at football practice, and, again, you got to go back to the time. I mean, 2001, I'm in high school, you're either high school or close to it. And we have never known anything but peace. I mean, it's hard to remember that because we went through, decades of war after that, and we had war fatigue, all of America did. But you have to go back and remember that, people our age, when that happened, to us, war was something that only happened in movies and books. It was an old concept that didn't exist anymore and wasn't real and couldn't touch us. And so I think my classmates were all struggling with that, concept. And so one of my friends at football practice, like I said, we'll never forget it. He said out loud, kind of wondering out loud, he said, well, man, guys, what do y'all think is going to happen? Are we going to go to war? And I chimed in immediately and said, of course we're going to war. We just had thousands of Americans killed on American soil. And I'll also never forget it. And I won't say this friend's name, but another friend immediately started laughing like crazy and like, what are you talking about? We're not going to war, And my point is that, just illustrating what I was already talking about, that to people our age, it was just really not a concept that we could, wrap our heads around. But like I said, because of my dad, I did understand that the significance of what had just happened. And so talking about, what you asked and just kind of the significance of it, on my life, I mean, it had a major impact because that was my immediate decision. You mentioned Kelly, my wife, today. Well, back then she was my girlfriend, and she lived here in Jackson, and I lived, outside of Hattiesburg. And so, literally that day on 9/11, I called her and told her I was joining the Marine Corps. And, it was, never forget that either. I mean, she didn't bat an eye at it. I mean, she I had to explain to her too the significance of it, and I told her, look, we're going to be going to war. We just got attacked on American soil. Thousands of Americans died. We're not going to let this pass. Whoever's responsible is going to have us at their door, and I want to be a part of that. And Kelly immediately said, and we already knew we wanted to get married. We'd been dating several years by that time. We were early, lovebirds. I mean, we started dating when we were 15 years old. I think you and your wife may have been similar to that. So, at this point, we're seniors in high school, getting ready to go to Mississippi State together, already, kind of planning a wedding kind of stage, of things. And so that was hard for her, but I'll never forget that either, is that she understood, what that meant to me. And despite the great personal risk that it posed to her and her dreams for the future, I mean, she didn't want to stand in the way of that. And so that was kind of the beginning of that chapter of life.
So you joined the Marine Corps and ended up getting deployed to Iraq.
That's right.
Was that a couple of years later?
It was a couple of years later. Yeah. And there's a little bit of a kind of story within the story of even just getting into the Marine Corps and the timing and everything that happened. But yeah, ultimately the result was that, shortly after I was officially in, I mean, when I say shortly after, I was in college at this point, and I had finished boot camp and, combat training, and then, your school that you go to where you just kind of learn your MOS is what it's called, your military occupational specialty, and finished all that. And I had joined the Marine Corps Reserves, which there's not even one in where I was in Jackson, Mississippi anymore. But at the time, there was a Marine Reserve unit in Jackson, Mississippi. And so I joined that because it fit what I was looking for. I mean, I wasn't looking to make a career out of the military. and that at that point, I really already knew that I strongly suspected that I might end up becoming a lawyer. And I'd been doing debate in high school and gotten, really into that kind of thing, and had done really well at it. And, go Warriors, because they really helped open a lot of doors there for me through that debate team. And so I was already headed in that direction. And so it wasn't like I wanted to put, everything completely in a different direction and go, pursue a career in the military. And so to me, the reserves was a really good fit because, especially in the Marine Corps is very big on this, is that, every Marine is a rifleman is what they say. And what they mean by that is it doesn't matter what your MOS is or, whether you're active or reserve or whatever. And so you all get the same training, you all do it together. And so, I knew that I would be, fully trained and prepared like any other Marine. But when I was done with that and, early training, I could come back to Mississippi and, start, pick back up my, college and keep going that route. And so all that to say how quick it happened, it took a while to, for everything to settle in and for me to get in. But when I did, things moved quickly. And what I mean by that is when I finished all my training, I showed up at my very first, reserve drill in Jackson, Mississippi. I was still asking a friend of mine, who later became a friend of mine, but just the first guy I saw, like, where do we form up? What's going on? What time are they going to form us up? And I was there like hours early at 3 a.m, and all that. But anyway, when we finally did form up, the very first thing the gunnery sergeant told us, and again, my first 5 minutes at the unit, and he said, well, start packing your bags, boys, we're going to Iraq. So my first drill in Mississippi, I learned that I had orders. And then, after that, there were a lot of changes in logistics and plannings, and there were a couple of times where I almost got booted off the deployment because I was the greenest guy in the unit, and I fought real hard to stay on, and ultimately, fought my way onto kind of our equivalent of a kind of front lines operating group that had some really highly trained Marines on it who were great guys and are lifelong friends of mine. And so it kind of went from, you're just completely green, fresh out of your training, to you're deploying right now, to you're in a platoon with some of the most highly trained Marines in theater, to, now you're back in the States and injured and in hospital and all that. So it was just a real roller coaster ride.
Well, so I know you have shared that your battalion saw some of, or maybe the highest number of casualties.
The highest, yeah.
Okay.
In the global war on terror, yeah.
And then you lost a leg.
That's right.
In the war.
Yeah.
Can you tell that story?
Yeah, absolutely.
How did that day come about?
Yeah. It was, like a lot of these stories out of Iraq, I mean, it was such a different war. And what I mean by that is you're fighting an enemy that, you can't see, and you can't identify who the enemy is until you're in the fight, And so, like so many of those stories go, I mean, we were up on alert that day. And so, that may be a little different. And the reason we were up on alert was because there had just been a lot of IED attacks that day and mortar attacks that day. And so our battalion, we were actually starting our first real big operation. And a part of this, too, is that, I mean, I kind of alluded to it earlier, but I got injured very early in the deployment. And so, aside from being a very, green Marine in general, I'm also green, in theater, have not been in Iraq that long. And, you're still getting your bearings and all of that. And, we'd had some close calls and, run-ins and things that, were scary, but nothing really could prepare you for, this day, which was March 18th, 2005. And so our battalion, we were starting our first very big operation, and the objective was, to essentially flush a lot of insurgents out of the surrounding villages in our area of operation and start pushing them towards the Syrian border. And, that was going to be, just as you can imagine, a very delicate operation to begin with. And high, risk operation. And so the first part of our objective was to go reclaim a forward operating base that had been abandoned for a little while because, like I said, we were still early in our deployment. And so the last battalion that left, they pulled out of that. And when we came in theater, we had not yet gone and kind of reclaimed it. So it was, when I say it, forward operating base, all it was a school. It was a school, that the Marine Corps had taken over and fortified and turned into a forward operating base. That was, and a forward operating base is just a building that's away from your main base. So it gives you some cover, gives you the ability to do, some things that are helpful, but it's pretty exposed. And so we were planning on going to that. We got all these attacks that happened. So the battalion headquarters called us and told us to halt, stop proceeding towards that forward operating base while they decided what was going to happen. Are we turning around and going back? Or are we going to go look for the terrorists who are, the insurgents who are conducting all these attacks? Or are we going to continue on to the base instead of the forward operating base? And so we had an hour sitting, in the desert, to contemplate what was about to happen. I mean, we knew that a lot of activity was going on, and whenever the radio came back, that was going to be a very pivotal, as we mentioned, kind of radio call. I mean, it might mean just go back to the base and we get to, knock off and watch movies on our little tiny portable DVDs, or it might mean we're in for a fight, And so that hour was a big hour for me. I mean, I spent most of that time praying. I wrote Psalms 23 on the only piece of armor I had on my Humvee, which was my door. And again, going back, you'll remember that there was a big, it was kind of a big national controversy at the time, was that, Iraq was such a different war. We really needed up-armored Humvees is what they were called. And later we got MRAPs, mine-resistant, ambush-protected vehicles, which a lot of them are made here in Mississippi. And but when we came into Iraq, that was not a thing we had. We had regular Humvees that were not designed, specifically to survive IEDs and massive, explosions. And so we had one up-armored Humvee in my platoon. My platoon had 4 Humvees. I was driving Victor 3, which just means Vehicle 3. I was the third in line, as we proceeded anywhere. And so what we had done is put our one up-armored vehicle in the very front of the convoy so that if one of us hit a bomb, hopefully it would be them. That sounds terrible, but that was the rationale. And the rest of us had no armor. And so I had one door that was armored. And I mean, it was not great armor, but it's what I had. So I wrote Psalms 23 on that. And, all that to say, you kind of knew going in. It was a very tense situation. And so we got the call back. It said proceed to the base. But they changed the plan. Instead of using the normal, little roads that led there, they told us to navigate through the desert, open desert, using GPS, or our equivalent of GPS and Blue Force Tracker is what it was called. And so we went on this, it could have been a fairly short ride to get there, but very lengthy ride through, off-roading through the desert. And as we got there, we were coming up, because we were coming through the desert, we were coming from the rear of this school. So, it faced a road, and if we had gone through the village and everything, we would have just pulled up in front of it on the road and gotten out and walked into the school. But because we were coming up the way we were, what we did not know is that in the interim, while it had been abandoned, not abandoned, but it was not actively manned, insurgents had come and planted a massive minefield all around the back end of it. And there were anti-tank landmines is what these were. That was the standard thing that insurgents used at the time for, to hit Humvees. And they were also, it was actively watched. So in other words, it was near town. And so there was a small hut nearby that there were like 30 some odd insurgents in. I mean, they couldn't even really fit in there. Again, we didn't know that when we were rolling in. But as we came up on it, the other thing that made it, just impossible to navigate, and, we didn't know until we got there, but as we're coming up on this abandoned school, because it had been a forward operating base that, the prior battalion had been in and out of all the time, what you're doing when you're driving one of these Humvees, especially in the desert, is you're trying to stay on the tracks that the vehicle in front of you is leaving, because if he didn't hit a mine, then you're not going to hit a mine.
Right.
But we had increased what we called our dispersion from 100 meters or so to maybe 250 or 300 meters because of all the mortar attacks that were happening. And so the rationale there was to spread out and try to not all get hit by one mortar or just a volley of mortars. And so we were already spread way out. The Humvee that I was following was way, far in front of me. So it was already hard to find his tracks and stay on them. But then when we got close to this forward operating base, what we didn't know is there were thousands and thousands of vehicle tracks all around the base from the prior battalion that had been in and out. So now you come into that, and there's no way to know. I mean, the closest vehicle is 300 yards in front of you, and even if you could see the tracks, it wouldn't matter because there's thousands of tracks.
Yeah.
And so we were just blind. And so, another kind of odd facet of it is that I kind of knew it was about to happen. And so even though I hadn't been in country long and all of that, your spidey senses are going off with all this risk that you have, how exposed you are in this situation. And I'd heard that this could happen a lot, from other Marines. And I'll say too, you mentioned our battalion was the hardest hit in Iraq or Afghanistan combined. The battalion in front of us had started getting hit real hard on the back end of their deployment. So when we got there were some pretty, battle-hardened Marines that we were replacing. And, of course, you talk to them about your AO and what's going on, and they've seen a lot of nasty stuff, and they're warning you. And it can get pretty scary just talking to them about it. And so, but a lot of them had told me that this could happen. And so as we had just gotten into that situation, you're already very worried about it. And I looked over and I saw a bunch of kids playing soccer. And I'd seen myself that typically when they saw a convoy of Humvees, they would stop playing soccer and they'd start running towards you because they wanted candy out of your MREs or whatever. And they were just friendly. They were very friendly kids, despite, how tense of a situation all that was. And so we had just gotten in here, couldn't see the tracks, way too dispersed, all of that. And I looked over and I saw these kids see us and just stop playing soccer and stand perfectly still. And so I said to the sergeant who was in my, passenger seat, I said, hold on, we're about to get hit. And then within a second or two, massive explosion. And so what had happened was my front left wheel hit an anti-tank landmine. And since I'm driving, you can tell front left wheel that was right on me, which I'm very grateful for because, one of the things, what was hardest about all of that, and I'll just fast forward briefly to say that, I was injured and obviously taken out of country, but, obviously my battalion and my platoon, who I was very close with, stayed in country. And a lot of my friends died, just terrible circumstances. And that was what was hard. Losing a leg was not hard in comparison. And so I've always known that, even what I just told you, and I know objectively that, everything I said, you're 300 yards away, you got thousands of tracks, there's nothing you can do to avoid this. But nevertheless, I want to avoid a mine, and I hit a mine. And, and it's buried underground. You can't see it. Again, objectively, all that. But if anybody else in my Humvee had gotten, hurt or killed, and that could have easily happened. I mean, I only lost my leg, but just give you an example of this. 2 weeks after that, a guy in our battalion hit the same kind of anti-tank landmine, and he was in one of those fully up armored, Humvees, and he broke his neck and died, immediately. And there were lots of stories like that. Yeah. But I'm just saying, even in an up armored Humvee, you could have hit one of these anti-tank landmines, and it could be fatal. And so all that to say was that I've always been very glad that it was the front left wheel that hit that mine and not any other wheel, because it got me, and it got me good. And, if you see the photos that we still have of it, it ripped the entire front end off of that Humvee, blew it sky high. The entire Humvee leapt into the air. Of course, I didn't see that, but my friends have told me it just leapt into the air, it just in an unreal way. And for me, I was conscious for it all. And it was an excruciating experience where time slowed to an absolute crawl, and I was very aware of what was happening to me. And I was, of course, in excruciating pain in every nerve of my body, and didn't know if I was going to live, if I was going to have a face, if I was going to be paralyzed. I thought I was paralyzed for a little while afterwards because I just couldn't move my legs, from the just getting your bell rung that hard. And so, but all that to say, I mean, the guys that were with me took great care of me. I mean, I was pinned in the Humvee and could not get out. And even after I realized I'm alive and, I can move and all of that, the metal of the Humvee had just pinned my good leg. My other leg had twisted up into my face, and the leg was, unsalvageable, and I knew that. And so immediately upon being able to, not be in total darkness and see what's happening, I knew I've lost one leg, and the next thing I'm looking at is, do I have the other? And so, I saw that it was trapped. I couldn't really tell if I had it below the knee or not, but I could not get out. And this is one of those fog of war things. I still to this day don't really know exactly what happened here, but what I do know is that we either received mortar fire or someone thought we were receiving mortar fire. I'm not sure. I still don't know. And I say that because there's mixed reports on it, and I've even looked at our battalion record, and it says there was mortar fire in the area and all of that. But I say that because I was so in and out, it was hard to even really know what was going on. But I did know that right after that, guys were calling incoming mortar, take cover, and I couldn't. That feels, really exposed too when, you can't even move to, get under something or get on the ground. And so, despite that, the guys that were with me, got me out, carried me, into the school, and then, took out the guys that were still there who were, they came back out. The guys who had planted that minefield, once I hit it, they came out ready for a fight. And so, the guys that were with me, took care of that. Ultimately, after individually getting a lot of the insurgents and then locating where they were coming from, called a massive airstrike on it and kind of took out the rest of them. And then, I got helicoptered out to a field hospital in Balad, Iraq, then to Germany, and then back to the States. And it was just, as you can imagine, it was just a really, an experience that you, at 21 years old, you didn't ever think you were going to be having, and, led to a lot of growing up really quick. But anyway, like I said, for me, it was always, as bad as that might sound to people, that wasn't the hard part at all. The hard part was sitting in the hospital, hearing about friends of mine who, weren't going to make it back, or watching other friends of mine come into the hospital I was in and have gunshot wounds all over them, or, terrible injuries. And so that was what was hard. I mean, the rest of it, losing a leg, you can get a prosthetic and you can learn to walk again, you can learn to run again. And I did, and, learned how to do everything again, and you can fix that. But, when there's guys that you want to be there with and want to make sure that, that they come home, and then you're powerless to help bring them, keep them safe, and watching them not come home, that's really tough at that age, especially. Yeah.
Well, I first thank you for your service.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
And your brothers and sisters. So last week I was invited to speak to a scout troop on the topic of citizenship.
Yeah.
And as I was thinking through what citizenship in this country means to me, I thought about the word stewardship, and that each generation has stewarded this great blessing of liberty that we have. And and the thing that I thought about over and over as I was preparing for just what I would say was, there have been examples throughout our now 250 years as a nation where every generation people have stood up and fought for the blessings of liberty, even knowing they probably weren't going to get to live those blessings because they might lose their life. And I think about, the men that stormed the beaches on Normandy who had to know there was a good chance they weren't going to live in the blessings of liberty, but they were fighting for something that the next generation was going to get to have. Yeah. And so man, it's hard to transition from that story to policy, but I just that stuff matters so much, and it makes me so proud to be an American to think about the stories of, and that's just one of hundreds of stories of people who fought for this country and sacrificed for it.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you. And for me, it was the greatest honor of my life. I said already, I was only 21 years old, when I got injured, and my short, career in the Marine Corps was coming to a rapid close. And all these years later, I've spent half of my life as an amputee now, which is just crazy. How fast that goes, and all of that really feels kind of like a lifetime away, which it's seared into your memory. And so it's weird because you remember it like it was yesterday, but at the same time it feels so, long ago, like I said, a lifetime away. But nevertheless, at 21 years old, I've always felt like, I experienced the greatest honor of my life at such a young age, and just I feel incredibly blessed to have gotten the chance, especially to serve with the guys I served with. I said earlier, I mean, we still remain close, and they're just some of the best guys that I can imagine. And just, it was, like I said, just an honor to stand with them and be a part of it,
So maybe take us through, you came home, finished college, ultimately law school, got married, put down roots, and then got to practice law. What were those years like? What kind of law did you practice, and how did you transition to this public interest law?
Yeah. So in terms of, you said, what were those years like? Those years were very strange, and I couldn't really process it at the time because I've said a couple of times I was 21 years old, and so even though you've seen these movies and kind of, things portray it, when it's strange when it's actually happening in your own life, it's hard to recognize it. And you also kind of tend, especially as you're a 21-year-old Marine, and so you're very battle hardened and like, oh no, I'm fine, and I'm tough and nothing matters to me. And so the first thing is, I didn't experience nearly the difficulties that a lot of guys did coming back, and I know that because I've witnessed the difficulties that a lot of guys had coming back. And so but it's such a strange thing that I think anybody who winds up in that situation at all is going to experience some degree of this. And it's just you get back home and everything feels so trivial now. And so because you've been in a situation where literally all that matters is life and death, and we in our modern world are not used to even having to think about that at all. And you've just been in a situation where that's all you think about, and that's all that matters. And just like that, you're thrown back into our modern world where it's, go to the mall, or, this celebrity dissed that celebrity, or, or so-and-so's mad at so-and-so. And it is a very difficult thing and really all you want to do. And it wasn't just me. I know, lots of, guys that went through the same thing. All I wanted to do is go back to Iraq. I mean, I actually wound up, kind of doing a big push in the Marine Corps to try to get me back in Iraq at the time. And so all that to say, it was just a real strange time. So Kelly and I had gotten married, not, as on the timeline we originally planned, but because I was deploying, we decided, look, I mean, we've always wanted to be married, and, there's no guarantee, I'm coming back. So, if that happens, we want to have been married before that happens. And so, so we had gotten married, here in Jackson, weeks before I shipped out. So then I came back and I'm, injured, don't really know what my life as an amputee is even really going to look like, because you haven't, had time to live it yet. And thrust back into college, and I'm also married, which I have no experience in being married, much less being married at 21 while I'm in college. And so but Kelly and I just, we got through it together. I mean, she was, my rock through all of that. I mean, when I woke up in the hospital, she was there. I wound up being in Washington, D.C., and as an outpatient mostly, but in D.C. for 9 months, getting all of that done. And she dropped out of college and, moved up there with me. I mean, we were just living in literally a hotel room for 9 months. And while I did outpatient treatment and prosthetics and all of that. And so, same thing when we got back. That, obviously being there was kind of a new challenge. And then getting back to school was a new challenge. And, Kelly just, like I said, was my rock through it all. And, it was new. A lot of it was new for both of us. But, we just figured it out one day at a time and got through it. And it wasn't your traditional college experience, but it was. I wouldn't take any of it back. And so, then I told you earlier I kind of always thought real hard about law school, and so that seemed like the next natural step to me. I was a political science major at State, and so I always also had this kind of concept of what I would describe at the time as the intersection of law and policy. I didn't even really know exactly what that was going to look like, And so, but I knew I was interested in the law, and I also knew that I liked, kind of an adversarial setting where I could, really test my mettle in terms of advocating for a position. And so went to law school, really fell in love with constitutional law there. And, I guess that's no surprise given my interest and everything. And so just really came to love it there. But there just really weren't any opportunities to do the kind of constitutional litigation that I was interested in Mississippi at the time. And so, which I think was a blessing because ultimately I thought about going and working for an out-of-state group that did that kind of constitutional litigation. But Kelly and I were having our first kid by the time I was, in my third year of law school. That really grounds you, as you know, and makes you think about where do I want to be, where do I want to set up my family. And so we both decided we wanted to set our roots down here in Mississippi, not move to D.C. or something like that. And so, I wound up going and working at Butler Snow and doing litigation in the private sector for many years. But to my point earlier is that I think that wound up being the right move because I got to work with some of the best attorneys in the country in a great litigation practice group. So I really learned the mechanics and the art of litigating from some of the best. And so when I did get an opportunity to, kind of switch careers and, take all the hits that come with that, you're leaving, a big firm and the life that comes with that and everything to go work at a small nonprofit, and really the only nonprofit and the only position in the state of Mississippi that does this style of constitutional litigation. But when I did get the chance to do it, you're really on your own. Nobody else had done this in Mississippi yet. And it was, there was nobody really to learn from or any of that. And so I think if I didn't have the, significant litigation experience that I had and the training from some of the best lawyers that I had, it would have been very difficult to come into that role kind of on your own, figuring out a type of litigation that very few lawyers in the country do. And like I said, no lawyers, in Mississippi were doing. And so, I think that I was well prepared to work through that and get make that transition.
So American Dream Legal is the public interest law firm. Tell us a little bit about what it does and the kind of cases you work on.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's interesting because I think American Dream Legal and Empower really have very similar missions, honestly. I mean, y'all want to empower people, to live their best lives. And a lot of that is economic and, being able to have upward mobility and access to, good jobs and all of that. And that's really, what we want too. And so, we're really, Empower and American Dream Legal are just using different tools to try to accomplish the same objectives is what I think. For me, when I get involved, obviously the target is going to be a lot smaller because, there's got to be a situation in which, the government, at least in our view, is violating the Constitution. It's not just a policy choice they're making, but they've gone so far, beyond the pale that what they're doing is actually unconstitutional. But, what we do is we represent people for free when they're in that position. And so, from the work you do, and I'm sure that a lot of your listeners are aware too, just from, listening to your podcast and following your work, that there are a lot of barriers, especially in Mississippi. And that's one of the reasons that I focus on that here, to work, and particularly kind of anti-competitive barriers that are put in place, by the incumbents in a field that, it's kind of a good old boy system, and they use their connections to government officials to make it harder for other people to come into their industry and compete against them. And so I think, especially for a conservative state, I think we have a real problem with that in Mississippi. And so now there's other things that we do too. That's kind of the cornerstone, I'd say, is as the name implies, the American dream, your ability to pursue the dream, and somebody, it's the government officially, but they're usually doing it at the behest of somebody else, is just standing in your way. And of course the government can forcefully stand in your way. And so when that happens, we'll represent individuals for free and challenge the law that the government has adopted that makes it either impossible or virtually impossible, or whatever the case may be, for them to enter that, that job that they want to do. And so I just think that's such an important thing, because like I said, number one, we have a real problem with it in Mississippi. And number two, it's such a vitally important part of what it means to be an American. Our nation was founded, and people, can forget this or not even really quite grasp it. But, in the old world, anybody who came to America had never experienced anything like what we offered. So your life was set out for you, from the get-go. It was who your parents were, what their trade was. That's what you were going to do, what class you were in, what you were allowed to do and not do, really was dictated by the circumstances of your birth, and you had no control.
Yep.
And people, just came to America in droves, because what we offered, what our nation offered, was the ability for you to control your destiny. And that seems normal, to a lot of people now, but at the time that was unique in history. And so, to me, it's a core part of what makes America America, and makes us who we are. And we need to always remember that and not stray from it. And not only that, it's so important in the lives of individuals. I mean, the ability to, shape your own destiny, like I said, and live your life according to your choices. It may work out well for you, it may not, but just the dignity even of being able to be the one who makes the decision, either reap the rewards, of it, or suffer the consequences of it, but move forward with your life. It's just, it's such a vitally important thing. And so, and also, as we all know, we've got so much poverty in Mississippi. And so to restrict people's economic opportunities in, the poorest or one of the poorest states in the nation, to me, is just, it's utter insanity. And so that's one of the big things that we work on.
Well, so the perfect example of this, one of the early cases I remember you taking on, speaking of coming to America, I think was an immigrant who came, and the case was a barrier she faced to do eyebrow threading. Can you talk about that case a little bit?
Absolutely. And so, these days, I think, honestly, a lot of people know what eyebrow threading is. At the time, it was kind of new. It was kind of new. And so just for anybody who doesn't know, it's a practice that originates in East Asian countries that is essentially, instead of waxing your eyebrows or tweezing your eyebrows, they thread your eyebrows, and they use some twisted cotton thread and a technique they have that just kind of grabs hair and pulls it out. And there's apparently a lot of benefits to this practice. It's doesn't hurt as bad as waxing and tweezing, very safe, and the hair doesn't grow back as quick, and all these things. And so it's really caught on here in America. And so our client was somebody who came to America legally and, was in college, and, she was very entrepreneurial, and she had come here looking for her American dream. And she saw this opportunity because all of her friends in her dorm, once she knew how to thread and she had done it for them a time or two, they were just lining up outside of her dorm, room wanting her to do it all the time. So she went out and started a business, and it just boomed. She was hiring employees. She couldn't keep up with demand, was making good money doing it. And so unbeknownst to her, of course, here in Mississippi, we had a law that said you can't eyebrow thread without a license. And
from the government,
from the state of Mississippi. And so, the thing about it, and the reason we challenged it, is that there was no safety risk from this practice. I mean, you weren't going to hurt anybody by threading their eyebrows, period. It was not going to happen. And so it's not like there was some safety aspect to this. But then even worse was that the what you had to do to get this license, the curriculum you had to take and the test you had to take and all this, just amounted to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours of training that you had to undergo. And the, again, worst aspect of it was that none of that training taught anything about eyebrow threading, because the people at the Mississippi, Board of Cosmetology didn't know anything about eyebrow threading. They couldn't teach it or test on it. They had never heard of it, mainly. Well, they had heard of it because they had heard enough to go lobby the legislature to get it added into the statute.
To something they would ban without a license.
They would ban without a license. And so anyway, my client, Deepa Bhattara is her name, and she's just a very inspiring young woman. And so she didn't let that hold her down. So, an inspector came in, told her she had to shut her business down. She tried to start pursuing this license, but she was, getting a degree at the same time and just could not juggle this, this very demanding cosmetology curriculum that didn't teach her anything about what she was actually trying to do. And so, she found me and came to me. And like you said, it was one of the early cases that I had done. And so I'm really grateful that, it's things like this podcast is the way, I just mean things like that is how she even knew that I existed. And so we connected. As soon as she told me her story, I said, absolutely, we'd love to help with that. And so, we challenged that law. And, the long and short of it is that ultimately the legislature repealed the law. Honestly, it was the Board of Cosmetology. I mean, we had a very good case, and they knew we had a very good case. And so essentially the Board of Cosmetology folded on it. I mean, they went with us to the legislature to say, we would like to settle this case. The way we settle that is we change the law back to where it doesn't require this license anymore. But of course, we can't do that. The legislature has to do that, and the governor has to sign it. And so please, change the law back so that it doesn't require a license for eyebrow threading, so that we can get out of this lawsuit. And the legislature did. The governor signed it. And in fact, we had gotten some other clients at that point that had similar situations. And so it wound up actually grouping 3 different things: eyebrow threading, makeup artist, and eyelash artistry. All 3 of those got taken out of the statute, so that now anybody in Mississippi, who wants to do that can go out and do those 3 things. You don't need a license. You don't need hundreds of hours of training or thousands of dollars in fees. And the last thing I'll say about it is that Deepa has now opened 7 or 8, maybe more, and counting, salons here in Mississippi. She's got a contract with Walmart. She is killing it. She's got employees all over the state.
Way to go.
Yes. I mean, she is absolutely killing it.
Entrepreneur.
I mean, very entrepreneurial. And I honestly think that her business is going to get to the point, it is rapidly growing across Mississippi. I think it'll be one of those businesses that in the not too distant future, all of us are familiar with the name. I mean, you and I may not go get our eyebrows, threaded, but we'll recognize the name of her business because that's the level on which she's succeeding. And that's, again, an example of why in this kind of case, I mean, there was no way around it that the Board of Cosmetology was not going to go to the legislature any other way. The legislature wasn't going to change it. So unless you had, a lawyer who would take your case for free, because, I mean, she couldn't afford to pay a lawyer either, and do what we did, there was no way that story was going to happen. So that's somebody who, chased and caught their American dream and is living their American dream and is employing other Mississippians along the way and, providing a great service. And none of it would have happened, if you weren't there to help file that, file that lawsuit and pursue their case.
What a great story. And it's also just an example of how sometimes the lawsuit doesn't actually resolve it through the court system. Mm-hmm. It is enough to get the attention and put a spotlight on the problem that needs solving that in this case the legislature was able to solve. Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit. I teased at the beginning I want to ask you about school choice. Mm-hmm. You, in partnership with the Institute for Justice a few years ago, submitted an amicus brief in a lawsuit that was going on in Mississippi that wasn't directly related to school choice, but indirectly could have impacted school choice. So you have argued that school choice in Mississippi is constitutional. Why do you think that? And maybe start with why do people think school choice might not be constitutional here?
So we have a provision in the state constitutional, Section 208. You mentioned it earlier, that essentially says that it actually specifically refers to an old account that doesn't even exist anymore. But these education funds that used to exist in the state are not going to be, shall not be apportioned to, to private schools. And really, even that provision itself dates to a period when lots of states around the nation were putting provisions like that in their constitution because it really came down to an anti-Catholic bias that existed at the time. So you're dealing with a very antiquated...
This is called the Blaine Amendment.
Exactly. And so, point being is that you don't even need to get into this, but to make the argument I'm going to, tell you here. But from the jump, I mean, you're dealing with an arguably unconstitutional provision of the state constitution to begin with, because it animates from that anti-Catholic bias is what's really going on. But even setting that aside, people will look at that and say, well, then, this school choice bill, is unconstitutional because, we'll be, allocating public dollars to private schools. And so the point there is that, you're well aware of this, is that people confuse or intentionally confound, the concept of vouchers with, the ESA program, or even aside from vouchers, will make it sound like it's a direct apportionment from the legislature to like, oh, this private school, we're going to send you thousands of dollars from the state coffers. And the point is that is not what is being proposed or has been proposed in the legislature at all. And so what has been proposed is, that parents would have, money that was set aside that they could say, I want to use, this portion of money, that I can use. Maybe I'm homeschooling my kids and I want to use it to buy books and curriculum and testing supplies or whatever. Or, I want to put it towards tuition at this private school or whatever the case may be. But my point is that we do that, our state government and federal government does that a million different ways all the time. And nobody says, would, even argue that is the government, funding, for example, food stamps. Nobody would say like, the government is funding Kroger or Walmart,
right?
Or apportioning money to Kroger. They're not. It's not that the money. The benefit is going to impoverished individuals, and
they're shopping around and choosing, and one of their options could be to spend it at Kroger.
Could be Kroger, could be somewhere else. And so the point is that the benefit is flowing to that citizen, and we recognize in any other context that is not the government allocating money directly to some entity.
And as a side there, school choice supporters wouldn't support the government directly appropriating money to private schools, because that is destroys the entire purpose of school choice, which is to put parents in the driver's seat and let them shop around.
Absolutely.
So it's kind of ludicrous.
Exactly. So you just on the face of the text of the Section 208, when you look at it, you can see an immediate problem for anybody who's trying to argue that this prohibits an ESA program, because you see right there, like you said, the legislature is not appropriating money to private entities. So that just from reading it. But fortunately in Mississippi, we don't have to even just rely on the text and kind of going back. And I have gone back and looked at the history of Section 208 and kind of the evolution of it. And it's not worth getting into here. But when you do look at that history of it and the evolution of it, it becomes even more clear that that's not what it was designed to do, what anti-school choice proponents kind of try to use it for. But aside from that, you have the fact that not only have similar programs been upheld in many other states by many other state Supreme Courts who have similar Blaine amendments like we do here in Mississippi, but aside from that, our Mississippi Supreme Court has looked at a case that is, the analogy is dead on. The case is on all fours to this. And so what that case involved was the the state set up a program to lend books to students. And, the same argument was made was that, this was supporting private schools. So in other words, those books, just like an ESA, the kid could use them, could go to a private school and, carry with them the benefit of like, that private school doesn't have to pay for a textbook for me now because I used the state program and got this book from them, from the state. And so the same arguments were raised in that case to say this is, apportioning money to appropriating money to, these private schools because you're taking something that the state has paid for, should be for the benefit of public schools, but now private schools are getting the benefit of it. And, the Mississippi Supreme Court was very clear that was not what Section 208 meant. And so because of that, I think, we wrote this in the amicus brief that you were talking about, is that it's pretty clear, under current Mississippi law. I mean, you don't even really have to, to predict that much. I mean, we've already got law that's pretty much directly on point that tells us that an ESA program like the kind that has been proposed in Mississippi would not violate Section 208.
Well, and we already have an ESA program for
Yep.
kids with special needs. We have a voucher essentially for kids with dyslexia,
Yep.
and we have a speech language scholarship program. All of those are the legislature appropriating public dollars to families, letting them shop around, and they can choose a private school if they want to, and none of those have been challenged.
Seems
Constitutionality.
and it seems to me it seems a little disingenuous that those haven't been challenged, but then the broader one would, because point being, I think that is pure litigation strategy. Is that the folks who would like to challenge an ESA program know, I mean, just like you said, the same mechanics apply to both programs.
Correct.
But they know that it would be very unpopular for them to be seen to be taking away these programs from kids with disabilities or whatever the case may be. And so they're not attacking that, even though the logic is the same.
Correct.
So
the other issue that always comes up around the constitutionality of school choice is about the federal establishment clause and church and state, because public dollars could be spent, and in other states that have ESA programs, could be spent at a Catholic school, parochial school, or Christian school. Why is that acceptable?
Yeah, I mean that's one of those two that's been settled. And you're talking about kind of federal precedents there, and so that's been settled at the U.S. Supreme Court level too. Just being again very clear that those kind of programs don't violate the Establishment Clause, and it's really just kind of common sense. I mean, in those settings, the government's goal here is not to establish a religion. It's the same thing where the goal is to provide options to these families. And if those families happen to go, use those dollars at a private school that happens to be Catholic or happens to be some other religion, that is very incidental to, the purpose of the program. And again, the U.S. Supreme Court has recognized that in the Espinoza case and, elsewhere. And so, to me, that's kind of a red herring argument. I mean, it's just, it's not going anywhere,
Well, so, I mean, while we're on this topic, if I could get you to take your con law hat off for a second. You're a dad.
Mm-hmm.
You got 4 kids.
Yep.
You and I both live in a community with great public schools.
Yep.
This is kind of the hottest topic right now in public policy circles.
Yep.
What do you personally think about school choice?
I mean, to me, I think that, I had this conversation with my kids. I mean, they were asking about it, and I explained it to them. And I think, I saw it, is that if you explain this to a kid and you have to explain it, at the basic level, any kid immediately grasps how ridiculous and absurd our current system is, to say where kids are going to have to go to school, and regardless of whether that school, is an A-rated school or a failing school or anything like that, it's determined by their zip code. I mean, this goes back to early in our conversation when I was talking about the old world and your life was dictated by the circumstances of your birth. I mean, it's a very similar thing. To me, that's a very anti-American, approach to anything. And I think if you explain it to a child, you'll see very quickly a child can understand how unfair that is. And so what I think about it is I understand that we've got, building the school systems that we have. And, that leads to entrenched interest behind the current systems. And this is the way we've always done it. And then you have other issues of, well, I don't want this school to hurt my school or whatever the case may be. And so all that to say, I understand where the opposition crops up, but I just think if you get to the very basics of it, some of the arguments opposed to it, have to get so technical to try to make the argument make sense. You start talking about economic development and all this, and you're thinking, we're talking about children and their education here. What is best for the kid? That's all that really matters. And so I think when you really just talk about that, it's really a pretty open and shut case that no child's education should be dictated, whether they get a good education or a failing education that doesn't help them, that it shouldn't be tied to where they were born and where they live. And so I personally, think that we need to get somewhere different than where we are. And I think that's the right and just outcome for Mississippians. And, and I hope that eventually, and I think the momentum, people like you are fighting for that. It may come my way if it gets passed, and then some folks want to challenge it, then maybe I'll get involved on the back end. But, folks like you are, y'all are doing a great job. And, from everything I've seen, from the outside looking in, even though there's recent setbacks and disappointments, and there's always been setbacks and disappointments, and it's been a real hard fight in Mississippi. And, despite all that, what I see looking at it from the outside is that the momentum is clearly on y'all's side and the school choice side. And so to me, it just feels like an inevitability. Maybe I shouldn't jinx y'all, but that's what it feels like to me. It feels like this is going to happen. The people understand it. The message is out. You can't put that genie back in the bottle. It's eventually going to happen. And it's just a question of how long it takes to grind down, kind of the people that are kind of benefit from the status quo or are scared of change and all of that. But eventually it's going to happen. And so I think it needs to happen.
Well, we're running long, but I have loved this conversation. Let me get to one more case. So you had a big win a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Can you share that?
Yeah. So that was actually an interesting case that involved healthcare. And so there's more than this involved, but I'll keep it to kind of the narrower issue is that there was what was referred to as a moratorium in place. So this was our client was a physical therapist who wanted to engage in home health. And so it's a very standard, form of medicine that, as the name implies, you practice it in the home. It's well defined on what you can and can't do. No safety problems there is my point. You're not performing open heart surgery in somebody's home. And so he wanted to get into that, but unbeknownst to him, when it was really COVID that sparked his interest in that because home health was very important during the pandemic, and so he wanted to help out with that. And he had experience in home health in the past, working for a home health agency. So when he went to, kind of expand his business from just a brick and mortar physical therapy clinic to a home health agency that could come in and do physical therapy and other things in people's homes, he learned that there was what is still referred to as a moratorium on new home health agencies. And to be clear, that doesn't mean nobody could do it. It just means the people that already existed, the businesses that already had the certificate, as it was called, they could do it, but no new people could come in and do it. And so I kind of laughingly say a moratorium because that moratorium had been in place since 1981. We're in 2026 now, so it had been in place 45 years, which to me is that's a ban. That's what that is. It's prohibited by law. And, the moratorium didn't say until this date or this statute will repeal at a certain time or anything. It just, you can't do this. And so, I looked into that, law for that client. His name was Butch Slaughter. Very great guy, very good, competent physical therapist. And, what I saw when I looked into it was that, and this is kind of one of the bases that you challenge these types of laws on, was that, this even involved going and digging through the archives of our state government and looking literally at meeting transcripts that happened in 1981 or 1980 or 1979 and seeing what people were saying in public meetings all those decades ago. What was going on? Why did this moratorium come into being? And so, what it looked very strongly like to me, and, ultimately we proved, in the case, was that there was not a legitimate, reason for this. That there was, a arguably legitimate reason that on the very beginning, where you had a state agency that was essentially trying to get its hands around a new form of healthcare and certificates of need that had just come up and needed a 6-month pause to kind of understand the lay of the land. But what happened and what it looked like happened, when I went and looked into it, was that a lot of times once the government gives a shield, from competition to certain industries, they really don't want to let it go. And that's what it looked like to me. It didn't look like there was any reason why this had stayed around 45 years later. We still had it. And so we challenged that on behalf of our client. And, that is a very extraordinarily difficult kind of case to win when you're talking about, first of all, any kind of economic liberty cases, what those are usually referred to as, the standard that you have to prove is the hardest standard that you can prove in any kind of constitutional law case or any other type of case. And aside from that, especially when it's in the healthcare setting, because, courts by default are going to give a lot of leeway to, the government potentially is, protecting health and safety here. Clearly that's a big concern in the healthcare industry, and who am I, some judge, to come in and nitpick that? And so, you're already in the hardest legal realm, and then you add the hardest industry on top of that. And so those are very rarely does a plaintiff succeed in that area. But I felt strongly from the beginning that, to me, this looks egregious enough that despite all that, I think we could win this. And so we filed the lawsuit. It was a very long, hard-fought lawsuit. And despite all those obstacles, we had a federal judge agreed with us and literally struck that moratorium down. And so as things stand today, anybody who wants to apply to open a home health agency can now apply. Before, if you applied, the government wouldn't even review your application. Mm-hmm. It would literally just throw it in the trash because the law said they couldn't grant it, if they wanted to. And so now anybody in the state, it went from nobody could even try to get into that industry to anybody in Mississippi can try to get into that industry. So again, kind of just an example of that kind of, let people pursue the American dream, and, in this instance, I think, patients have access to more options. This goes for eyebrow threading or anything. I mean, it helps the consumer or the patient. It helps the provider or the entrepreneur. And so I think it's just good for, everybody all around. It's what America, was founded on. And so I was very proud to, be a part of that case, and also just, help our client do what I think will help patients in Mississippi. And, even the aspect of it of, getting a win in under very difficult circumstances. I was personally very proud of that aspect of the case too.
Well, for somebody listening who thinks they might have a case, they're facing a barrier, whether it's a board or commission or some regulation. Are you taking new cases?
Absolutely. So, there you will see on our website, if you go look there for this, we actually do list out, in more detail than our conversation today really allows for, but the exact types of cases that we do specialize in and kind of what we're looking for in those kind of cases. But you can read that, and on the website you can fill out a form, and that form guides you through some pretty detailed questions so that we can get a real specific idea of exactly what is involved in your potential case. But so to do that, you just go to americandreamlegal.org. Very simple, because the name of our organization is American Dream Legal. So americandreamlegal.org, and there's links all over the website to to submit a case is what it'll say, or other things like that. But just click on one of those links. It'll bring you to the section where you can read about the types of cases we can and cannot handle, and some of that is legal regulations that apply to us. Some is just the specific areas we specialize in. But look over that and fill that form out. And, if it's meant to be like some of these cases we've talked about, then, we'd be happy to step in and help you out for free is the big part of it. So.
All right, last question. When you're not suing the government, what do you like to do? Any hobbies?
Man,
do you have time?
Yeah. I mean, I'm kind of an outdoorsman. I like off-roading is something I've gotten into more recently, but I like to hunt and fish and all that. It seems like the last couple of years have just been so busy. I haven't gotten nearly as much opportunity to do all that as I like to. But our family, I mean, we went to the Ozarks, just to go hiking and off-roading last spring break. So, we did get to do that. But just anything outdoors is what I like, just getting out there. Like I said, whether it's spring break and just, being in a cabin in the mountains and going hiking with the kids, or, going out and fishing, or, off-roading, whatever it is. I just like being outside, out in the woods especially.
Me too.
Yeah.
Well, I love the work you're doing. You're doing important work. Thank you for your work, and thank you for coming on the podcast.
Well, I appreciate it, Grant. Thank you for the work y'all are doing too. I said it earlier. I think we're pursuing the same things, using different tools, and very glad that to get the opportunity to come on here and talk with you today.
Thanks so much for listening to today's episode of the Empower Podcast. To learn more about how you can get involved and we can work together to make Mississippi a place where everyone can rise, go to our website at empowerms.org. Please like or subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you'll be notified of future episodes.